One day he took part in a swimming competition at his school where the winner would get a scholarship to a well-known campus. Andy, whose life was barely making it every day, didn't want to miss it. It was a golden opportunity for him. Therefore, he trained hard to win the competition. But unfortunately, the fortune was not on his side. He had to lose the competition and he didn't get the scholarship. Moreover, his friends and crush began to ignore him. Andy didn't want to be shunned, so he promised to do whatever his friends asked him to do. Hearing that, his friends asked him to steal beers at the store where his mother worked. But unfortunately, his friends betrayed him by just leaving him. And because of that, he was caught by the shop owner. Not long after his father, Jim, came and scolded him because of his actions. His mother was almost fired from her job, fed up with Andy's stubbornness, who had been caught stealing 3 times. Jim decided to entrust Andy to his cousin Trent on a remote island called Walton Island. Not accepting his parents' decision, Andy decided to run away, so he quickly packed his things. At that moment, he accidentally found an antique watch that belonged to his father and decided to take it away. His action was caught red-handed by his younger brother, Mark, who immediately warned the whole house. The next day, Andy and Mark were taken away to the port during journey, and he felt very sad. After losing his friends and the scholarship, he felt abandoned by his own parents. When they got to the port, they met with Trent. Even though Mark was happy to meet him, Andy was the opposite. He still couldn't accept that he would live with his uncle. But Jim said that he was doing all this so that Andy could learn to take care of himself and take responsibility for looking after his sick little brother. He had problems with his ear and couldn't get near the water, even though he wasn't very happy. Andy had to obey his father. After everything was ready, they went to Trent's house by boat, arriving at Walton Island. Trent took Andy and Mark to his house. There, Mark looked at a map and saw that the place was located very far from the city. To go there, it would take them about an hour. And even if they went to the city, it would never find them all there. The island was very sparsely populated and very mysterious. Trent said that the remote island was once owned by their family, but soon would fall in the hands of a very rich businessman named John. John often went back and forth to the island using his private plane. That night, Trent revealed a fact about their family, which turned out to be very rich. But everything changed drastically when his father and his grandfather was found dead in a strange ship accident. Since then, all their wealth disappeared without anything remaining any. Grandfather had kept all his possessions in a place that no one knew where. Trent tried to look for them, but to no avail. So in the end, he chose to just let them go and live in the shackles of poverty. Hearing that, Andy decided to run away from home and look for the treasure himself. But fate was now on his side. When he entered the forest, someone caught him. But when the man found out that Andy was Walton's grandson, Andy was finally released. When Andy returned home, he felt that the treasure had something to do with his father's antique watch. Shortly after, Mark told him that Trek told him a story about their grandfather's treasure, where the treasure was hidden in a place full of mystery. Hearing that, Andy got more enthusiastic. He was determined to find the treasure. Andy started looking at his father's antique watch, which turned out to be a watch left by his grandfather. Inside, there was an inscription that said, "Gift of Time," which seemed to be the first clue to the treasure. When Andy tried to look for other clues, Trent almost caught him. But because it was already late, Trent told Andy to go to bed. The next day, when Andy and Mark were looking after Trent's souvenir shop, a woman came to the shop. This girl turned out to be Andy's crush at his previous school, Claire. Apparently, Claire's purpose there was for a holiday, but she didn't like it at all. She couldn't enjoy her holiday because the island was far from anywhere. When he heard that, he immediately took the opportunity to invite Claire to go for a walk with him and Mark to the city. When they were cycling, they accidentally passed through a forest and saw a warning. Andy and Mark were challenged to go inside, especially after Claire said that the forest was full of ghost stories. Andy invited Claire to go inside, but Claire refused and left them. Meanwhile, Andy had to go into the forest to look for Mark, who suddenly ran into the forest first after finding Mark about to get out of there, and he fell into a hole and even asked Mark to call Trent and ask for help so he could get out of there. But after an hour, Mark didn't return, and Amy panicked. Fortunately, not long after that, Trent showed up and immediately saved Andy. Thanks to this incident, Trent scolded Andy and Mark for entering the forest without permission. He also found out that they were after the treasure there. Trent then loudly warned them never to enter the forest again. The next day, when Andy and Mark were helping to look for lobsters for their dinner, Mark's hand was pinched, but someone suddenly appeared and quickly helped him. It turned out that the person was John, who's also Claire's father. After finding out that Andy was Walton's grandson, John invited him to dinner at his new house, which turned out to be Andy's grandfather's former house. Before leaving, Andy intended to take the necklace from Trent's shop, but he was caught. Andy gave an excuse by saying that the necklace would be a gift for Claire for inviting him to dinner at her house. But Trent didn't seem fond of it when he found out about it. He didn't warn Andy to be careful of John, who, according to him, was a cunning and evil person. Trent suspected that John intended to use Andy to drive him from this island, remembering that Trent always refused to leave every time John kicked him out of islands, so he could make the island a resort. After hearing that, Andy still went to John's house and was warmly welcomed by John. John and Andy talked about many things. In the middle of their conversation, John asked about his grandfather's treasure. Andy pretended not to know anything. John told him that his grandfather had millions of dollars. Not long after that, John got a phone call and told Andy who he from outside. Claire saw him and invited him to look around the house before the house was about to be destroyed. While walking around, Andy asked about Claire's mother, whom he had never seen. Claire told him that her parents had divorced when she was little. Andy felt sorry to hear that, but he said that at least Claire was born into a rich family. She could still live comfortably with the money her father gave her. Offended by Andy's words just now, Claire told him that wealth didn't guarantee a good life. She then said that the house could have belonged to Andy if only Trent had not lost in gambling with her father. After that incident, Andy decided to go home and immediately look for Trent in his room after arrival. But instead of finding Trent, he from another antique watch. Trent suddenly showed up and immediately took the watch. Andy knew that the watch was a new clue to finding the treasure, so he immediately invited Trent to look for it together before someone else found it. But Trent refused and forbade Andy to look for the treasure because it was impossible. Andy felt annoyed because Trent kept forbidding him from doing anything until finally an argument between the two broke. But when Trent wanted to explain something to Andy, Andy instead went to his room and didn't want to listen to him anymore. Not long after Mark came and was curious about the clues that Andy found, Andy told him all the clues he had gotten. Mark thought that he could solve the puzzle. Andy asked him to tell him, but refused to tell until Andy let him look for the treasure with him. Andy was forced to agree, and after Mark told him, they carried out the search that very night. They decided to go to the coast to look at the star names because Mark was sure that the clues came from the constellations. They continued to wait in the hope that there would be an answer, but unfortunately, they didn't get anything. Andy, who felt annoyed, asked Mark to just go back home, and with heavy steps, they left the beach and returned home with a disappointed heart because they went without Trent's permission. Last night, they were scolded and their bikes were detained. Shortly after, Claire came to apologize to Andy for offending him. Andy didn't say anything, so Claire decided to just go home. Suddenly, Andy wanted to talk and invited Claire to go to the beach tonight. Claire looked happy and immediately agreed. That night, Andy, Claire, and Mark went to the beach. Andy then gave the necklace that he had taken from Trent's shop. Claire then gave him a key necklace as a gift. But Andy refused. Mark, who liked the necklace, finally took it and immediately wore the necklace. Andy, who was starting to feel annoyed by Mark's presence. Charlie tried to drive his brother away from there by telling him to look at the lighthouse at the end of the beach. Mark initially refused, but kept pushing him until finally Mark wanted to go. Andy and Claire took the opportunity to talk more intimately. They expressed their feelings for each other until finally they decided to date each other. Meanwhile, Mark, who had just arrived at the lighthouse, found something there and in a hurry, returned to tell Andy what he had just found. He said that it was another clue to the treasure. It turned out that the constellations mentioned by his grandfather are not real constellations, but rather the name of the lighthouse Polaris. When he heard that, they went straight to the lighthouse and started looking for other clues. They managed to find a new clue through the watch. Unfortunately, the answer to the clue required them to go to their grandfather's former house, since their bikes were confiscated by Trent. They were forced to take Trent's car and go to Claire's house when they got there. Claire went to meet her father and stole the key to the private room, which she believed was the answer to the clue. After getting it, Claire sent Andy and Mark to go first. Inside the room, Andy from a typewriter immediately tagged the code he had found. Soon after, a secret door opened to the loud cracking sound, which made them startle John, who heard it immediately went towards the sound. Luckily, Mark and Andy managed to enter the secret room first before John arrived with a gun in his hand. After the tension subsided, Mark and Andy went around the secret room belonging to their grandfather. There they found a key and a strange object, although they didn't know what they were. They were sure that these two items were very important. In the end, they decided to take the items with them before leaving the room. Then they left the house and approached the car. But both of them were surprised to see Claire waiting inside. Claire immediately told them that John already knew about them, so she ordered them to leave before John found them. Andy and Mark immediately rushed to go home when they got home, waiting for Mark to get ready for the next journey. And he apologized to Trent because he had stolen his car. Trent somehow forgave him. He said that in the past he often made similar mistakes. He then shared a story about his past, which was full of regret. Not long after, Trent invited Andy to his room. Feeling curious about the box Trent had been keeping, Andy opened it, and it turned out to contain some swirling metals. One by Trent. Andy accidentally knocked a bottle containing a letter from the desk and broke. It is shaking. We read the letter that contained Trent's apology to Andy, admitting that he never felt worthy of being a father to him. In his confusion, Andy read the other papers in the other bottles, one by one, until finally he began to realize the truth that his father was not Jim Trent. A mix of confusion and deep astonishment struck his heart with feelings of annoyance. Andy drove Trent's car and went into the forest to continue his search for treasure alone on the way. Andy's eyes fell on a sign, carving an old tree at the same time. The object he had brought from his grandfather's secret room suddenly rang. Andy carefully pressed the red button on the object until finally a secret door opened beneath him. He was curious and has only stepped into the door, but his excitement. Something changed when he was trapped in the mysterious room because, unfortunately, Andy only had one key while the door behind him was shut. He tried to contact Mark using the transceiver he was carrying, but there was no answer at all. Finding out that Andy and Mark lost Andy's mother, Jim and Claire went to Trent's house. A tense atmosphere filled the room with Trent and Jim argue with each other. Claire stopped them by saying that she was sure that Mark and Andy were together in the forest to look for his grandfather's treasure. And without wasting more time, he decided to follow them into the forest. Meanwhile, amid his despair, Andy continued to reach Mark until suddenly Mark's voice was heard through the transceiver, asking about his whereabouts. And he felt a great relief when he heard his brother's voice and immediately gave Mark instructions. Mark finally managed to find the secret door and the two men again. They hugged each other, and Mark sincerely said that even though Andy was not his real brother, he would still love him as the best brother he had. Not long after, he tried to open a locked room, and he told Mark that they needed 2 keys to open the door. It turned out that Mark had another key. The key that Claire had given him unexpectedly matched when they put the key, and at the same time the door opened, and finally, they found the treasure they had been looking for. It turned out that the treasure they had been looking for was the largest gold mine in the world. That happiness was suddenly gone when John arrived and planned to take the treasure. All this time, he had been after the Walton family's treasure because he once helped Andy's grandfather keep all the gold. But he never bought a share of it. Suddenly, the door was locked tightly, and it was written that the door could only be opened by the Walton family. John urged the two to open the door, but they refused until finally John pushed Mark into the sea. Seeing this, Andy, who was full of anger, immediately pulled John until they fell together into the sea. Mark relentlessly asked for help. Trent Hurt rushed to help him, and thanks to their help, Mark was saved. But an unfortunate fate befell Andy, who was carried away by a strong current and was drowned. Seeing that without hesitation, jumped into the sea to save his son. A few moments later, with great effort, both were finally able to return to the surface. But when they emerged, Trent lost consciousness. Andy did everything he could to save his father while reflecting on every moment in the past. Andy reflected on every mistake he had ever made towards his father. This burdened his heart with regret. Fortunately, Trent woke up from fainting, and he was so happy to see it. This strengthened his determination to improve his relationship and become a better son. The next day, John was found dead. As a result, Claire had to leave the island to bury her father. Not long after Trent approached Andy, and finally the two of them started talking to each other again. Trent said the reason why you left Andy with Jim 15 years ago says he lost his wife. Trent felt depressed and worried that this would have a bad impact on Andy. Therefore, he decided to entrust Andy to Jim so that Andy would get good care. After hearing that, Andy accepted the fact that he was Trent's son after John's death. The island that he had previously bought returned to the full ownership of the Welfin family. This brought peace to the family who were reunited. They finally understood the intention of their grandfather, who deliberately put a puzzle on his treasure because he attempted to unite his family again.